My name is Dr. Josephine Palermo, and my superpower is creating business cultures that transform organizations team by team. With my co-host, Dr. Iain Butterworth, we speak to philosopher Ole Hoffken on the good life. We explore the concept of resonance and what it tells us about creating a life of meaning and happiness. We hope you enjoy this conversation as much as we did.
Hey, Josie. How you doing?
I'm great, Iain. Nice to see you. It's been a while. I miss you.
2023 is rushing ahead.
It is.
Which is an opportune time to pause and consider what it's all about. And I'm really delighted to welcome Dr. Ole Hoffken to our discussion today, who is a visiting scholar from Germany, who is a philosopher, and his research interests are the good life. So Ole and I connected through mutual friends in Hamburg. I've known people in Germany since I was a young 20-year-old backpacking around Europe, and here I am several decades later, still connected to those wonderful people, and Ole is too. So when Ole identified that he was coming to Melbourne, he got in touch with me, and we've spent a bit of time together. It's been a real pleasure to have a chance to share Melbourne and Central Victoria with Ole, and to learn something of his life and times, and also his interests in philosophy. So Ole, I hope I'm going to do you justice by explaining something about your interests. I'm actually reading from an abstract from a paper you gave at Deakin University.
Hi. Yes, thanks a lot. I'm just saying hi now as well.
Yes.
And, thanks for having me.
That's actually probably a good segue for me to stop talking and invite you to say something about yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks a lot. So, as you already said, Iain, I'm currently postdoctoral researcher in philosophy. I'm at Heidelberg University in Germany, and now in the last week of a research stay here in Melbourne at Deakin University. And the question of the good life, I mean, it's an old, venerable philosophical question, and this is one of the topics I'm working on, having some work in progress, more or less in that direction at the moment. And Iain, you promised that you would read something from an abstract of a paper I have, so I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, so the question of what a good or happy life or flourishing human existence consists in has been a preoccupation of philosophy, religion, and most recently psychological thought. And it looks at the choices we have to make individually and collectively, consciously and unconsciously, about how to live our lives. And when I learnt that you were coming, I was very interested to have a chance to talk with you on this podcast, because the discussions that Josie and I have on here are linked to the fact that humans spend a lot of our time in organisations, even if we're not sitting in organisations as much as we used to, because we're doing a lot more remote working. Mm-hmm. We're certainly having to take part in the strategic planning processes and the rituals and the conscious and the unconscious, the spoken and the unspoken cultural elements of organisations. Mm-hmm. We're expected to go to the barbecues and the ceremonies where people leave or join, or all of those things. So I was really interested for us to have this discussion about what makes for a good life in an organisation, and how can people flourish in organisations. And I'm really interested in your interests in philosophy, but also the fact that you are interested in evolutionary anthropology and psychology. And I mean, Josie and I come from a background in psychology. Josie, organisational, me, community. But it's a rare opportunity for us to actually think about what makes for a good organisational experience, talking with a real life certified philosopher.
Yeah, great.
So, can you tell us about the good life from your perspective, and tell us a little bit about your interest in evolution? Yeah, over to you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks a lot. So maybe just to sketch the perspective, or maybe the perspectives that I'm coming from. So you've mentioned already this evolutionary anthropological take on the good life, and I take this as part of, let's call it an objective perspective on what it means to have a good or happy or fulfilled life. So this is one part. I think this is one of the perspectives we can and have to take. And the other is more the subjective side. So the actual, how does it feel like? What is it like for the people in the societies, in any given society or culture, to lead a happy and fulfilled life? And what I'm trying to do, in a way, is to bring in my work, from a philosophical perspective, or from a philosophical background, these two perspectives together. And you mentioned you are interested in how this plays out on the organizatorial level, on the level of organizations. I'm happy to learn a lot from you, maybe also in this respect, because what I'm so far have been focused on is, as I said, the subjective and the objective side. And on the subjective side, it's more on a very individual level, so very individual accounts of what people see as fulfilling lives. And I'm working with a certain philosophical, sociological approach there, which is called resonance theory. We may get into that later as well. And on the objective side, as you already mentioned, I'm more looking from the very general level of cultures and societies. So what are the basic cultural setups in a certain society that govern how we live our lives, and how is that developed?
Ole, I wanted to before we go into that, because I really want to go a bit deeper into what those cultural aspects are and what those subjective aspects are. But a lot of people listening may not even know what the study of philosophy actually entails, because unfortunately in Australia we no longer have philosophy departments. When I was going through university, I did a major in philosophy at Swinburne University, and we had a philosophy department. But unfortunately we sort of philosophers are still there, but they're not as pronounced. So before we go into that, can you explain what is the methodology? What does it mean to study philosophy, or the study of concepts from a philosophical perspective?
Yeah, great, thanks. So that's a very good question, and I think it's not so easy to answer, because philosophical methodologies are very varied. And what I've been hinting to with this subjective-objective distinction, I think these are two major approaches we can take on any phenomenon we want to understand in philosophy, but also in everyday life, or in more applied contexts, or in scientific contexts. And I think the only thing I would stress in a philosophical methodology right now, or in this context, as you said, we're working with concepts. So we try to develop concepts that can make sense of certain phenomena in our lives or in the world. And other than that, we are in a cooperation with everything else going on. I mean, practices in science, maybe in arts, all kinds of expressions of different perspectives. This is all possible to take into the picture here. So it's in this sense, it's a very general, multifaceted methodology. And of course, I can't do all of this in tackling this question. So what I'm working with are these two major perspectives I try to integrate, and like, as I said, the subjective and the objective, and on the objective side, this idea of our background as an evolved species, and also the idea of an evolution of culture in a way.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, Ole. One thing I've noticed in modern sort of social media land is people are confusing the subjective and the objective. A lot of people say now, oh, I really feel that that's not the case. People aren't actually, they put their feelings onto things, especially when they're critiquing deep issues, social issues. And I've noticed it a lot in the US discourse. People, when they're interviewed on TV or whatever, they say, oh, no, I feel that it's different to that. They're not actually skilled in testing their assumptions at an objective level. It's all about feelings.
Yes, so I think that's a deep philosophical question. How do the subjective, the intersubjective, and the objective hang together? And how do we get from the subjective? I mean, we all live our lives. We all are immersed in our very own stream of experience, so we can't get out of this, so more or less subjective sphere. But the question is, how do we come from there together? How do we triangulate, as it's sometimes called, triangulate the different subjective perspectives into an intersubjective framework, which then also encompasses some kind of objectivity, which is of course never perfect. And in a way, this is one of the background questions that stand always in the background of this methodology and this approach. I think something that this is a big question for us every time we all over the place in our lives. And this is maybe specifically something that philosophers worry about and that try to get a grasp on this question. And one thing I think is important is that we can't have the one without the other. So the subjective perspective of lived experience, as it's also often called, or this is how I feel like, this is how I feel this is. I think we would make a mistake if we would push it aside as merely subjective. We have to start from there. So in a way, we could say this has to be the first word in any kind of an inquiry or endeavor or like intellectual endeavor we start with. So this has to be taken into account. But it cannot be the last word. So we have to get to this kind of intersubjective triangulation or intersubjective matching or comparison of different perspectives to get to a way of speaking about what we want to get a grasp on. For example, the good life. You could also go on with a lot of other phenomena as well.
I think we're going to come back to that because so much work in organizational development is testing the perceptions of various people that are in a room or involved in some sort of brainstorming session or troubleshooting or dealing with some sort of organizational crisis, perhaps, in terms of how people are relating to each other. I mean, it's almost like a therapeutic process at a group level to try to help people move from the feeling state into looking at things objectively and being open to understand how things look to other people. So we'll come back to that because I think that's core to so much organizational development work. But before we do that, I think it would be useful to now hear from you about what this notion of the good life means, because I suspect that so much organizational work to build a strong culture and to help people feel valued and included, it's all premised on some assumptions about what a good life might look and feel like for people working together in an organization, whether they be volunteers or paid people or whatever. So, having talked about the complex relationships between perceptions and feelings, both at the individual and collective level, how does all that link to this understanding of the good life? I'd love to learn from you about what the good life means.
Okay, great, thanks. So of course I can't give the last and definitive answer of what the good life means, and all I can offer you is concepts that people have come up with. As we said, philosophers are people who try to somehow craft concepts to grasp something that is important to us. And what I'm working there with is a very recent concept that I mentioned before, the concept of resonance. So I'm not really going very deep back in the philosophical tradition of thinking about the good life, but I'm working with something very recent, which is maybe has developed over the last 50 years, which is the blink of an eye in the history of philosophy. And this concept of resonance, as I'm working with it, is explicitly developed from the perspective of lived experience, of how people experience their relation to the world. So it's all about relation. The experience relation you have to the world, which means to other people in the world, to other objects in the world, things in the world, to the situations you are in, the buildings you're in, the landscapes you're in, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that this concept of resonance is able to characterize a certain quality of relating to the world that is an essential part of what it means to lead a good life. So you don't have to be in a resonant relationship all the time. That's not the idea here. It's just the idea that to live a life that is fulfilled, people have to make these experiences of resonance. And what is meant with that is that a relation of resonance to whatever your other in a certain situation may be. It may be a thing, it may be a person, it may be an organization. A relation of resonance is one where you as the subject and the other are in some kind of answer relationship. So it's a give and take, it's a back and forth. You give something to it and you get something back from it. And neither you dominate the other nor the other dominates you. So of course, a very natural setting we might think of here is social relationships between two people. We would think of such a resonant relationship between two people interacting as something that, we would describe as fulfilling. And another aspect is that people, when having these kind of resonant relationships, feel themselves being transformed through this relationship. So it can be very mundane. It doesn't have to be a deep existential transformation, but if you have a resonant intercourse or in a chat, for example, just a chat with someone, you don't feel that you're totally the same afterwards. So you somehow have been changed. You're somehow another person, maybe very incrementally, but maybe very, very deeply. So this is this idea of this transformative aspect of it. And you also feel that you are able to transform the other. That is on the other, like on your opposite in that situation. Just one last point. So it's this give and take. It's this transformative aspect to it. And I mentioned the example of two people interacting, but as I said, it could also be something else. So Hartmut Rosa, that's the sociologist from Germany who came up with this concept. He also often discusses resonant relationships with pieces of music, for example. So you listen to the piece of music and it changes you somehow, it gives you something, but you also put yourself into it. So you give something in a way in listening to this piece of music of yourself, and it won't be the same in your lived experience afterwards. It will mean something else to you. So it could be a resonant relationship with people, but it also could be a resonant relationship with something inanimate. That's the basic idea.
I love it. See, philosophers, they ask the best questions. This is why I like the art of philosophy. I was interested in that notion of resonance. It's a lovely collective notion. I think in organisational development, we are very much looking at more collective ways of working and doing and thinking in organisations. So that is something we're thinking about. But particularly in the give and take, because you said that you and others, or you and an object, are in an answer situation. Does that require you to ask? Is there a question in that? Is it question answer, or is it openness and answer? Openness and answer. What are the conditions there?
That's a good question. I think it could be both. And what is most important there is the openness. So this somehow open intentional stance, as a philosopher would call it.
Yeah.
The open stance you take towards whatever may come along, and you might have an answer to a question to ask to that other, or not. It could also be just an open situation where you're lying on a meadow, maybe looking into the sky, and you don't have any particular question there right now, but it could still spin into this resonant relationship to whatever is around you at that moment. And you were also mentioning the conditions of resonance, and
yes.
this is then somehow where the objective part of this, the objective perspective comes into play. So, as I said, this framework was, or this conceptualization of the good life was proposed by a German sociologist. So he's also interested in Hartmut Rosa. He's also interested in objective, if you may call it that, societal structures, and how they enable or disable experiences of resonance. And again, so what he's looking at is only the conditions of possibility. He does not say that we can manufacture resonance experience in some way. We cannot force them. This is like another important aspect of this concept. All we can do is create open spaces, and we can do this more or less well in a society for these kinds of experiences to be able to happen. And this is what is then described as these conditions, it's even objective conditions of resonance. And all kinds of institutions and organizations, of course, come into play here. I mean, what kind of family structures do we live? And what kind of organizations do we live? What kind of institutions do we have? How is the economic life organized? To what degree is it commodified, and to what degree is it a market system? And all these questions. Yes.
I think your questions in your research is incredibly timely, because we're in the middle of what is being described as the Great Resignation, where people are leaving work situations in droves, probably because they want to pursue the good life. And this is something that I think COVID, the pandemic, maybe has forced people to reconcile with. The other thing, which is happening a lot in the United States, is this notion of ghosting. We're used to people ghosting each other on Tinder, but now young people especially, who are joining organizations where they're treated like commodities, and despite all the organizational rhetoric about, we're a great team and we're here for you and our organization's dedicated to making the world a better place, these people feel completely stuck in meaningless transactional relationships where their time and value as people is discounted. and so they just stop turning up for work. It's a new phenomenon, but organisations are being ghosted by people, and I suspect one of the reasons is they're not experiencing the good life as you've described it. There is certainly no give and take. There's certainly no sense of resonance. I mean, all the work that Josie does, and I to some extent, around creating organisations that are, safe to fail, where you create a culture where there is a learning element there, where people's experiences actually contribute to some sort of organisational transformation. That's certainly not happening for a lot of people. And so they just stop turning up for work and find something else that they want. It's just a comment, really. I think your work is very relevant to modern society.
Yes, so, and just taking up what you've said, so one thing I think that we can all observe in modern societies, that it's very hard to give resonance space and then to create possibilities, conditions of resonance in modern mass societies. And maybe I can take up a bit of the history there of this concept. So the background it developed from is from the critical theory, which is also like a venerable philosophical tradition or socio-critical tradition from Europe, beginning in the second, or developing in the second half of the 20th century. And already there, people have made, with the rise of modern mass consumer societies, these thinkers have issued the diagnosis of a general alienation in modern societies. And what then Hartmut Rosa did with his 2016 book, Resonance, is he said, okay, I want to develop something that is a positive counter-concept to this diagnosis of alienation. So these kind of traditional critical theorists, he says, they were very focused on the negative. They were only talking about these conditions of alienation. But the question is, what are we alienated from, actually? What is lacking if we feel alienated in a modern world? So these diagnoses are not new in a way, and it's just new conceptual refinements coming to it. But yes, of course, they are, I think, more urgent than ever to apply to modern societies. And what I might want to add there, just to give a short, a quick view into that, is I think thinking about these conditions of resonance in modern mass societies, on like the objective conditions of it. This is where this evolutionary perspective might be useful as well. I mean, some of you may be familiar with this general idea of evolutionary psychology that we have developed as primates in the so-called environment of evolutionary adaptation, which is the East African savanna in the last 5 million to 200,000 years ago. And we have developed there to live in small groups of flexible groups with flexible composition of 20 to 30 people, and with something like a broader social network behind that. And if like our brain is geared toward that, or we as a psychophysical system are geared toward that, then it's in some way no wonder that it's very hard to establish fulfilling or resonant social relationships in a very anonymous, large-scale society. Which does not mean that we have to go back to this small-scale way of living, but this may help us to understand why the conditions of resonance are so hard to establish in modern societies. This evolutionary perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Ole, this is. I've got so many questions going on in my head. I do want to follow this track of what are the objective conditions that create, opportunities for resonance. And I love that you're saying that all we can do is set up the conditions. We can't guarantee that subjective experience, because that makes so much sense as well. Because I think in organisations, a lot of leaders are grappling with how to create spaces in their organizational culture, even in their built environment. So a lot of, for example, a lot of local governments I know are looking at their office environment and how they can create the built environment in a way that creates more opportunities for people to feel connected to each other, and probably I hadn't thought about to elements, to other objects, but art and for example, I was recently at the City of Casey, and when you walk into their building, the whole front of their building is an art installation, for example, and they change it up. And, you can tell they're trying to get the community to feel something as you walk in the building. Are there conditions that perhaps are more likely to create that sense of connection? I'm talking about it as connection. That's my bias. Perhaps resonance was more the word for you.
Yes, I think this is all we can actually work with, to say, okay, this makes it more probable. This has a higher likelihood to create these kinds of experiences. But yeah, we can never manufacture them. We can never force them. And interestingly, so what Rosa in his sociological analysis points to is that exactly this approach of trying to make resonance experiences attainable is often a guaranteed resonance killer. So he calls this the triple A approach to life in modern societies, and with triple A he means making whatever is desirable attainable, achievable, and I forgot the last A, sorry. But it's basically about attainability. And resonance experiences, I think this has become clear already, are essentially unattainable. Unverfügbar is the German word there he uses. And in trying to make a new object out of it, and trying to make something to make it attainable, as we, for example, make a resource attainable, we often destroy exactly what we want to get. An example would be people making a vacation at a certain place, let's say Paris, and they totally want to have these deep experiences connecting to the place or connecting to the vibe or the people there. And because they have to expect, especially these expectations, once they are there, it's very hard for them, or even impossible for them, to just be open and just get into the vibe, because they already have all these fixed preconceptions in their head. And this AAA approach, this is Rosa's big thesis, is governing a lot of our approach in modern Western societies towards the world around us, both the inanimate and the animate world.
As you're talking, the dust from my undergraduate sociology is lifting, and I'm so drawn to talk about some of those early sociologists that were just doing all that amazing work about false consciousness. And it occurs to me that, in organizations we try to create an empowering organization would be one in which the leadership is devoted to creating a space where people can have an authentic consciousness and unpack the social learning that may have polluted, if I may use that term, their authentic sense of being in the world. But I guess a lot of organisations aren't interested in that, and they may even try to impose yet another false consciousness into their workforce to ensure that people are compliant, or that they produce all the widgets that are supposed to be produced every hour. Josie,
Ian,
do you want
I'm
to say
going to
something?
be the advocate because I actually have a much more optimistic view of
Oh, me too.
organisations.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes we lay all this on the head of leaders in organisations. You know, whose role is it anyway? Is it, for example, the state? Is it the government? Is it the organisation to create all of these conditions, or is it the individual? Who's responsible? Ole, I'm just wondering, where does this sense of, because what you're talking about is creating conditions that allow for openness, which I think I'm probably simplifying that, but I can understand that because in many organisations, when I work with particularly leaders and particularly executive leaders, that's what we do to help them transform themselves into being better leaders, is creating more openness in the way they think about leadership and their role. But whose responsibility is it? Because, you know, is it really, can we lay this on organisations? Because to your point, the minute you start to try to engineer this is when you're almost overlaying all those biases that mean you're not going to get there.
Yeah, so the question of responsibility, I think, as with many broad societal questions, it is really the responsibility lies on all levels, on the levels of individuals, on the levels of organizations, and on the levels of the broader body politic, the society we make up, the political system we live in. And as I said, this is work in progress. So, and it's not only work in progress for me; it's also work in progress for the other people. I think in the philosophical, sociological world, trying to make this concept work somehow. How to tackle this in practical context is, of course, very hard to answer. I think, in a way, this concept is meant as something more as a guiding thread. So, or as a star we can orientate ourselves towards. As I said, we can't force it, but we can, of course, try to make it possible to get there.
And I think just for you, Ole, just so because you may not be aware, in organisational development work, we use a lot of facilitation techniques that allow for emergent outcomes. So and I think that setting up a condition for openness, and you know, some of that you know, creating that sense of resonance, hopefully. But and often you know, we often have to instruct leaders who perhaps want to be more directive and you know, account for time when teams come together or when groups of people come together. And what we're often recommending as organisational consultants is allow for more space. You know, don't create an agenda that is minute by minute, you know, prescribed.
Yeah, great. So this is a great example. For example, this is a great example for trying to make it possible on an organizatorial level. But of course, organizations live within an ecosystem that is the broader society, and we also have basic, general cultural orientations there, and ways of seeing the world. And the idea, I think, is a bit that these kinds of, or in other words, we have somehow broad notions of the good life, either implicitly or explicitly. And this kind of conceptual framework, I think, is the attempt to develop somehow some concept of the good life that can just guide the orientations of people in organizations, but also in broader political arenas or cultural arenas. So it's basically, the idea, I think, is that it can play out on all kinds of different levels of social complexity.
I'm fascinated by this discussion, and forgive my lapse into Sociology 101 a few minutes ago. It was just really a thought bubble that I had. But I'm reading a paper that you produced on evolution and the good life, and you've quoted an author called Grinder, is it the
Mm-hmm.
right name? Who argue that the issue of the good life can be maybe attributed to two major issues, which I think you've touched on a little bit. But the first one is we are not designed by evolution for the sake of our quality of life, and we are not designed to live in an industrialized society. I mean, I'm fascinated and quite struck by those two statements because it takes us right back to the savannah, where our brains have evolved for the most of our existence. But I love the first one. We are not designed by evolution for the sake of our quality of life. Josie, how does that play out in an organization?
Well, I'd like to know more about what that means, firstly.
Yeah.
So yeah,
First we go to Ole.
so maybe I can try to unpack this. So the basic idea is that our feelings, our way of experiencing the world from a very objective perspective. So nobody knows why we actually have experiences, but we can take this for granted. It just comes about through in this otherwise inanimate world. So our bodies house some kind of mind and feeling consciousness. And this feeling consciousness, it has different ways of experiencing the world. Either, maybe characterized by states of fulfillment or happiness or resonance, and others that are stressful. And what Grinder is pointing to is that the explanation why these states are there is just like from an evolutionary standpoint, it's just that it has evolved in such a way that we are motivated to act towards reproductive success. And that it includes that we mustn't be happy all the time, because if we were happy all the time, then we wouldn't like get out there to propagate our genes, basically. So that's the very basic story. So this is what is meant with evolution has not created us or designed us for quality of life. So that does not mean that it's impossible to be happy. It just means that we have to be aware of these of the fact that just living by our nature is also not necessarily what makes us happy. So this is the first point, and then this problem is of course amplified by these so-called mismatches, which I've hinted to before, between our evolved nature and the conditions of life we now live in. And also, we are not doomed here. We are very cognitively flexible species. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to create such large-scale societies with our, let's say, hunter-gatherer mind. So we have this flexibility, of course, also in us, but it's hard to deal with it. That's to say the least. It's hard to deal with the life world in a modern mass society. And maybe I just quote another nice sentence from Grinde, which he says afterwards. This is what he now takes as the conclusion out of this diagnosis. So he goes on to say that biologically speaking, life revolves around the quandaries associated with survival and propagation. It is, however, up to us to give a damn about evolutionary or biological objectives and rather let happiness be the supreme purpose of life. Or, I mean, happiness is maybe a bit hedonistically put, but we could also say to have fulfilling lives or good lives, to be the supreme purpose. And this is, I think, somehow the program that we can take out of this evolutionary perspective as well, to be conscious of why it is hard to live a good life in modern mass societies, or why it is hard for humans at all in general. But to somehow deal consciously with these impediments we have, and to try to deal with them, and not get lost in these kinds of quandaries of propagation and status concerns and consumption.
Thank you for that. That's a great explanation. And you know, I can see that sometimes we do have to act in hedonistic ways because collectively that. You know, I love it. That goes back to then looking at the intersubjectivity of that and then creating something that is more about a quality of life or good life for ourselves. So sometimes that it starts in a hedonistic phenomenological way and then goes out to that more intersubjective space. So I can see how, for example, you know, organisations are tuning into health and well-being at the very individual level to really understand how they can set up conditions that help people flourish while at work. And that is very much about the individual, but collectively you end up with conditions at an organisational level that have impacts for the whole organisation and its outcomes and sustainability and even the planet. So, you know, there are sort of these ripple effects. So I'm probably not using your example of intersubjectivity well there, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about when I go to sort of apply it at an organizational level.
Yes, and I also think that we can be optimistic about this. I mean, we don't have really anything else to. It's always better to be optimistic than to be pessimistic. But so the hope I somehow have in proceeding along this approach of getting together this kind of resonance theory, this subjective perspective of the good life, and the evolutionary perspective, and also sociological perspectives on the let's call them objective conditions of resonant relationships with the world. So the optimistic hope I have in there, maybe a naive hope, but that becoming aware of these processes that go on in the background. I mean, hedonistic lures of the modern world. This is part of also a mismatch that we are just overcharged by all these hedonistic options we have in a modern world. I mean, again, we haven't evolved for that. I mean, sugar, alcohol, drugs are the standard examples, and also all these kind of arenas of competition, competition between people that have come up with the rise of a modern affluent society, which we also don't have the mental capacities really to navigate in a way. To be aware of this maybe is the first step to be more moderate in our dealing with it. So, and this is again on the very general societal level, cultural level, but it can play out, of course, also in the intermediate level of organizations and how they deal with, for example, internal strives for competition or cooperation.
I'm tempted to rush out and copyright the name Resonance to set up an organizational consulting company.
Yeah. So maybe just as the last point on this. So this concept is really getting some traction right now in the academic world in a way, but it's also already, and of course I have to make this pun at some point, it's resonating beyond the academic world. In Europe, at least, you can see this. So there are already conferences being held, especially on that concept. So let's see where it's gonna take us. Maybe this concept is going to be is maybe becoming too much then, and everybody tries to work with it, and then it somehow doesn't have a sharp meaning anymore. This is always a threat, but I think the next 5 to 10 years will show whether this concept will get traction and usefulness and applicability in the academic world, but also beyond.
So you subjected us to a pun just then. I'm gonna get back at you. What's resonated with you about your visit to Australia and Deakin? Why Deakin?
So why Deakin? Because I was working on my PhD 2 years ago. And there I was working on this this question of the integration of the objective and the subjective perspectives, actually. So, and the subjective is also often called, I think we had this term already, the phenomenological perspective, or the phenomenological take on life, actually. And so this is the broader methodological approach I'm working in. And I have some ideas there how we could make this work. This is more than on the very broad methodological, very abstract methodological level, so it's not as applied as what we're talking about today, but I think it's still relevant to understand how we can think about these questions. So this is what I was working on, and then I discovered just after finishing my PhD that there's another philosopher in the world who is doing actually the same thing, who is Jack Reynolds, who's a professor of philosophy here at Deakin University. So once I got the postdoc position, it was just natural to come down here at one point. And of course, this is for me, of course, a professional example of resonance. But other than that, I think it would be hard for me even to list all the things that have resonated with me here in Melbourne, in Australia, beyond just being able to work with who I really want to work with. I'm hard pressed right now to mention anything. So I have had some great musical experiences here. I had great experiences just being in the city and cycling around Melbourne, which was really great fun for me, actually. A lot of people warned me of it, but I really liked that, just taking in the vibe of this really massive place and this huge city with all kinds of different faces. I think that was very interesting. And traveling around Australia was also nice, seeing a bit of the nature part as well, being at the ocean.
Well, it's been great to see you just land and hit the ground running and make the most of every single experience and opportunity. It's fantastic.
Yeah, great. And thanks again for having this opportunity here also to talk about some of my, let's call it work in progress.
Ole, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved this conversation as well. I think there's so many questions, and this is lovely, isn't it, when you have a discussion and you walk away and there's so many questions, and also there are some concepts forming in my mind too. So thank you so much, Ole, for your time. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we get to do it again sometime. I'd love to.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Iain. Thanks, Ole. Have a great day.
You too.
All right.